Thank you, Alex, for that wonderful introduction. I always treasure your introductions. As Alex alluded to, the topic that we're discussing today is something that gets discussed a lot at conferences like this one. If you've ever been to a conference like this before, you've probably heard those 4 words. Sometimes they're presented with one acronym, CASE. Sometimes it's another, ACES. But it all stands for the same stuff: autonomous, connected, electric, and shared. And for years at conferences, we've been told that this is what the future will be. And I think what we're here today to do is to provide a reality check on that. Is that really actually what's happening? Are these trends real? Are they in development? Where are they in development? And what can we expect from them in the future? So to start off, we have just an absolutely wonderful selection of brilliant people to discuss this. And in order to sort of really set this, the tone of a reality check, I'm going to ask each of our panel members to think back 5 years. When they were probably at a conference similar to this one, probably discussing these 4 alleged trends. Please explain what your thinking was about these trends, or maybe 1 or 2 in specific, if that's your area of focus, and share your thoughts about how that trend has developed, and sort of whether or not what you expected has come to pass. Mr. Becker, we'll start with you.
Sure. As Alex pointed out, I've been working on autonomous driving and driver assistance now for a long time, almost 25 years. And at the first 15 years have been slow, gradual research. We made a little bit of progress every year. And then around 2008, Google actually put a great team together and made a lot of progress. Then around 10 years ago, around 2010, technology became mainstream that is now known as deep learning or deep neural networks. And that has actually led to a tremendous progress in how the sensors of an autonomous vehicle understand the environment. And that led us from seeing a couple of boxes on the street where we just made the assumption those are cars, to really a fairly holistic understanding of a street scene. So that made tremendous progress over 5 years. And then around 2017, a lot of people really made the assumption that progress would continue linearly, whereas it's actually not the first time. The first 80% are easy, the remaining 20% are hard. So the assumption that would just continue, and then 4 or 5 years later, or even less, we would have streets full of level 4 vehicles. That clearly hasn't happened. So to answer your question, if you would have asked me 5 years ago, I think we are exactly where we should be right now. But if you ask CEOs, press, media, are we where we should be right now? Clearly not. So I think we've had a bit of a hype, and the hype has actually become realistic now with respect to autonomous driving.
But you find that the actual technical progress continues apace for those who have been part of the sector.
Of course. So what we are a software company. We develop software frameworks for autonomous vehicles. What we have seen over the last year really is that the delay of level 4 street vehicles has been more than compensated for us with applications that are actually much more tangible and much more realistic, like autonomous construction vehicles, autonomous mining vehicles, low-speed shuttles. So all those scenarios that are actually realistic to be introduced in the next months or year or 2.
Okay. And Mr. Agassi, if you'd like to pick a time other than 5 years ago to start from, to establish your expectations, so I understand.
I was reflecting on the questions. I'll take you a bit longer, because earlier in the decade I was in a conference not too different from this one, and I happened to be on stage presenting Better Place at the time, and I was sort of discussing battery switch and so forth, and a gentleman in the audience who happened to be the CTO for GM, stood up. He just couldn't contain himself, and he said, "You will never have robots working on the side of the road. It's too complicated." And it just so happened that about 10 minutes later, he was on stage, and he said, "We're working on building autonomous vehicles that will drive in the streets of New York." And I couldn't contain myself. I stood up and I said, "Could you redefine the word complicated?" So every technology that you introduce, there are a lot of naysayers. We usually tend to be more optimistic, especially in this industry. In the car industry, development calendars tend to have 15 months instead of a year. But eventually, if something is bound to happen, it will happen, right? So Jan has been telling you he's been working on this for 25 years. We've had competitions early in 2003, 2004, where cars were able to drive. So the earthquake has happened. It's the tsunami wave that takes a bit longer to reach shore. And it's always hard to do the last sort of 0.1%, 0.01%, 0.001%. When we're doing battery switch, I think Barak is in the audience here, would come to me and tell me, the station is at 99.9%. And I kept reminding him, that means 1 out of 1,000 people will get stuck. And then he came in, we're at 99.99%. And then 99.999. And eventually you say, okay, that's good enough. We're good to go. I think in an environment where that 0.1, the missing 0.01 or missing 0.001 is a dead person, you have to be a lot more careful. You're not playing with beta software release. It's not a person that's stuck on the road. It's a person that you take their lives away. And so I think by and large, I think lighter technology needs to be completed. I think the software needs to be sort of debugged more than anything else. I don't think it needs to be completed, but more debugged at this point. And eventually we got to convince some insurance company that, this drives 100 times better than an 18-year-old kid with a phone on their right hand.
Can I trouble you just to share your thoughts on electrification specifically? Has that come along as much as you thought it would, more or less?
I think, again, if you look at our predictions back in 07, 08, we said that the cost of the battery will go down about $100 a kilowatt hour. When we said that back, we're called crazy or whatever, but we're sub $100 at this point. At sub $100 a kilowatt hour, with 1,000 cycles, you're cheaper than zero cost for oil, right? And so the thought process that governed us, that the battery is a consumable, that the battery consumes itself, if you want, with every charge cycle, and if you treat it that way, eventually it becomes cheaper than oil, it was right. What's sad is we sort of looked at niche markets instead of looking at the general market, which is what Better Place tried to do at the time. So if you look at Elon's brilliant market definition, he looked at people that had the ultimate range extender for electric cars, which was the other car, right? So he basically sold to people who had another car. We were trying to go after the broad market, and to do broad market, you had to serve a car that was more convenient than an average car. And you're still seeing a lot of the ideas that we've had back then rolling back, where IP is less protected, and but I think it's all goodness. I think eventually you're going to get there. Just to put in perspective, I think we're now, European market is about 2% electric vehicle market penetration. In the last 5-6 months of Better Place, it had more than 2% in Israel, and we're now talking, 7 years. So.
Okay, I want to come back to this idea that sometimes these trends are more true in certain parts of the market. For example, the high end of the market may be seeing more EV adoption, for example, than others, or more rapid EV adoption. I think that's a really interesting thing because it's so easy to take these trends and just try and apply them universally when there's a lot more nuance in that. But Mr. Wilshire, your thoughts on CASE, on ACES, how has that evolved over the last 5 years relative to your expectation?
I think if you go back, is this on? Yeah. About 5 years, we were looking at the very beginning of an industry that was at the very beginning of a major phase of growth, or a significant phase of growth. I think that's been largely borne out. If you go back 5 years, we were looking at less than 1 million EVs on the road. Now we're looking mid-year about 6 and probably 8 by the end of 2019. So it's still, to Shai's point, it's not a huge number in the context of all vehicles on the road, but it's definitely the early phases of adoption. And we're also talking about an industry in terms of EVs that's more like $100 billion a year of revenues. We certainly weren't talking about that 5 years ago. So I think whilst that's not massive in the overall context, it's still very, very significant growth. 5 years ago, we were looking at what were the barriers to adoption, things like model range. We've gone from, I think it was around 60 5 years ago, models, EVs. Now we're expecting it to be more like 400 by 2020. So that's, significant growth and helping to accelerate the cycle. Lithium-ion battery prices, we were at $650, trying to figure out what was the learning rate on lithium-ion. Actually, that prediction has held pretty good. We calculated about 18% learning rate for every doubling of volume. That's more or less held, and we're down, as you say. I think our numbers are a little bit above yours, but they're average numbers, so...
No, mine.
Oh, okay. Well, the ones you quoted. And we're anticipating more like $60 by 2030, so that's the real point, with price parity on an electric vehicle roughly mid-2020s, depending on geography. There's a very interesting point there, I think, which is as an electric vehicle gets to the point of price parity with another vehicle, there's a price elasticity effect that up until now has worked against you with an electric vehicle. It's been more expensive. At some point, it's going to become as cheap, or in some cases even cheaper. And I think that could, cause an acceleration. And you'll also get other consumer adoption kind of effects as people copy one another as they see more electric vehicles around. So we haven't been disappointed there. One standout example, which I think is really interesting, I got the numbers actually, in 2011 in Norway, there were 1% of electric vehicles as a percentage of total vehicle sales. 5 years ago, that had risen to 6%, and it was one of these things that went from 1% to 3% to 6% to 15 or something, and then right up to 49 at the end of 2018. It's very interesting because the reason for that, I think, is that the taxation in Norway meant that price parity came much earlier than in other markets, because all vehicles are taxed, if electric vehicles less so. So it brought forward that point of price parity, and look at the adoption we've seen then. So that's an interesting thing. And I think it's very important to watch what are the points of inflection in this industry as we go forward. There are still some issues in terms of infrastructure. I think charging is a constraint and needs to be resolved. And, where I said there are going to be by 2020, 400 models, that's still a limited number of models in what's been historically, at least, a fairly differentiated market. But overall, to sum up, I think, we're not there yet, but we're on the right kind of pathway, and all the signs are good in terms of various points of inflection.
I want to come back also to the role of policy in driving these trends, because I think Norway and the infrastructure problem show that that's a really important part of this, which also gets to sort of the question of, what is the fundamental motivation for these trends? Is it the economic opportunity, or is it the broader social good? Before we get into that, though, Mr. Scheer, if you could share your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. It's great to be here. When we, via 2012, started operating in New York City, it was strictly consumer business, shared ride, basically trying to improve the public transportation in a way that to be smarter. What we see since then, or following that, maybe two things to add to what has been already said. First, we see a tendency of regulators to go and take more risks in terms of regulation and be more open to these changes. We are working with regulators all over the world, over 20 countries now, and we really see this change coming in front of our eyes. And the other one is maybe the world is understanding more and more the importance of HOV, the high occupancy vehicle, over the single occupancy vehicle in terms of congestion. And these other types of technology, electric and autonomous, are moving also to be integrated in this type of modern transportation, making the public transportation better.
So one of the common themes I think across all of these trends is the question of a broader social good, right? As we mentioned, this is I think one of the reasons why when we see major growth in EV adoption, for example, there's oftentimes government policy behind that, and that is to drive a broader social good. Does that create though, challenges if the fundamental motivation behind some of these trends is not necessarily economic opportunity, or maybe from your perspectives, is there actually a fundamental economic opportunity behind them as well? And maybe it'll vary from sort of case to case. So in terms of the autonomous technology that you work on, clearly safety is a real fundamental good. Do you think that there's as much economic opportunity behind autonomous drive technology as there is social good?
Of course, there's the safety aspect, which will ultimately, once we get there, to fewer crashes, fewer injuries, less overall cost there. But there's also the opportunity to make traffic more efficient. Today in California, we have carpool lanes. Hopefully in a couple of years, we actually have autonomous lanes. That's then also an opportunity to introduce the technology earlier, because the environment, is limited, controlled. Yes, and then traffic there, I do foresee to flow, whereas on the neighboring lanes, and today in the carpool lanes, clearly it does not.
So doing good is going to make those who do that do really well, right? Let's put that for a second in perspective. Electric vehicles had an issue in penetrating the market because we had to convince people that this is going to be better for them down the road on a decision that was the second most important purchase of a family, a car, after a house. But when autonomous fleets will come into the market, you don't need to convince anybody to get into a transaction to buy a car, right? You come in, you get around your fear, you may not be the first one, but you eventually get into a car that will take you from point A to point B, and eventually you will get to the point where you grow accustomed to it. But the regulator is going to see something vastly different, right? They're going to see a decline in the number of car accidents that is a massive tax on the economy. You have, I think in the US right now, about the equivalent of a 747 crashing on the ground every day from car accidents. 93% of them are caused by human error. If we had a 747 crash on the ground every day, nobody here would fly. But we do get into our cars and continue to drive them with idiots all around us who are semi-attentive to what's happening, right? So once you could show a significant decline in the number of car accidents, this is not going to be a question. It will become a forced issue for the regulator to bring in. It will start from cities, and it will get to the entire country. But in the same vein, it will become a very big revenue source for cities and mayors. If you look at the most expensive real estate in the world, arguably, the sidewalk on Fifth Avenue makes a ton of money for de Blasio. But in between those two sidewalks, there are 6 or 7 lanes, and the mayor makes no money on those lanes. So the most critical real estate in the center of New York, the mayor makes no money on. The current numbers estimate about 15 cents, 16 cents per mile is the cost of autonomous mobility on a shared fleet. They will be able to charge, as the city, a tax, whether they are the operator or whether they tax the operator, anywhere between another 16 cents to $1 on a mile basis, and still make it cheaper than using your own car. Especially in a city where you need to park and you need to figure out how to get in and out. And so for the city, this will become a massive revenue source. When the city makes a ton of money, when the regulator wants it to happen, things will happen really fast. And that's a shift in an industry. Everybody here is part of that industry, worth trillions of dollars. It will shift from owning a car, 3 box, 5 people, trunk, to sharing and using a car on an ongoing basis without making a single big decision. The transition is super fast when you don't need to make a big decision. The transition is super fast when the regulator wants you to do that. And so all the forces, unlike in the transition to electric vehicles where you had to go against headwinds all the time, here all the winds are tailwinds. So people need to realize that the transition is going to be a lot faster from the point where the first wave will come to the next wave, the 50th wave, the 60th, the 100th city, the 250th city, the city that basically tells you, no, you can't park here anymore, no, you can't drive here anymore. The transition is going to be so much faster than anything we're used to in the car industry today.
Where do you think that inflection point is?
I think there are two inflection points. I think City 2 is massive. So first city, likely San Francisco or Phoenix, and then City 2. Eventually, when you get City 2, no mayor wants to be the mayor who doesn't do it, right? Just like no mayor wants to be the first mayor who made a big mistake and brought in autonomous vehicles to their city. I think no city wants to be the one that is left behind, and the mayor gets a demonstration about the deaths that happened in the city last night, right? That's not good. So I think that's one big inflection point. I think we'll start seeing disruptive inflection points, and I don't know how to time it correctly, but they're not good for anybody who's waiting for them to happen, right? So there's going to be a decline in the amount of new cars getting bought a lot faster than you have an autonomous fleet in your own neighborhood. Because we're all smart people, so we all will watch, and when the first city has an autonomous fleet, I'm not going to buy a new car. I'm going to wait for the fleet to come to my city. In the meantime, I have the other car. It's still parked and still working. And so there's going to be a decline in the number of new cars bought. There's going to be a decline in the residual value of used cars. There's going to be people, portfolios holding a lot of these used cars that will need to make decisions, and they'll need to make them ahead of time because nobody wants to be the last guy stuck with a bunch of cars. So there's a lot of disruptive decisions that will happen. And policy-wise, there'll be the first city that will basically ban drivers, the first city that will provide free autonomous service to all their residents. You'll start seeing a lot of these milestones, and it will happen, in my estimate, within 3 to 5 years of the first city going fully autonomous. So massive transition, faster than the industry is used to.
Yeah. Mr. Wilshire, can you return to sort of this question of public good versus economic viability, sort of which is driving these trends? Maybe you could pick one in particular if you like, but
well, I think it's not just public good and economic value. I think there are two trends I want to highlight, actually. One is a sort of consumer trend, which I think is well known, that younger people in general, the propensity to want to own things, and it's not just confined to cars, actually, it's a whole range of goods, is diminishing. So certainly when I graduated, the first thing you did was
Michael, would you hold the microphone a little straighter so we can hear you better?
Yeah.
Thank you.
The first thing you did when you graduated and had a salary was you went out and bought a car. It was a kind of rite of passage. That has passed. Nobody does that anymore. My daughter, who's just 18, I asked her if she wanted driving lessons. The answer was, why would I want driving lessons? By the time I need a car of my own, it'll drive itself, so what's the point?
Did you think you were giving her career advice to go join Uber or Via?
I didn't get that far. But my point is that I think it's really changing, and it's already happening in terms of Uber and ride sharing services, but I think it will also be a driver for autonomous vehicles. The second point I wanted to make in relation to policy is a slightly different one. I think other externalities, in particular air quality, are becoming incredibly important. I mean, it ties back to what you were saying, Shai, about cities. I came here from London. London is breaking a lot of the European standards on air quality at the the moment. It was not an issue in the public mind 4 or 5 years ago. And more recently, there's been a lot of publicity about it, a lot of evidence published on health impact. The mayor actually is asthmatic, so cares deeply about this. And you're seeing that sort of pressure and awareness start to become a real driver. So I think it's not just sort of economic drivers in terms of public policy, it's kind of social drivers and health concerns that will influence this as well, all of which points to electrification.
Yeah. And Mr. Chair, I want to sort of pivot the question, same basic question, I think, but a little more specific to the shared context. The social good that was really presented in the early days, especially of Uber and Lyft, was that it would, by sharing vehicles, we would have less congestion, fewer vehicles on the street. In a lot of cities, we've actually ended up seeing the opposite. So sort of the social good that on the one hand, Uber has become a very valuable company. On the other hand, they have clearly contributed to congestion in some places. I'm curious why you think that's happened, and if you think that that's maybe a transitionary phenomenon, or that there's something more fundamental there.
Okay. So first, I'd just like to add to something that Shai mentioned. We are talking about reality check, right? That's our subject. So we are not talking about like very far future. If we talk about the city that chooses public transportation and to use an autonomous fleet, so that's basically going to happen next week in Irvine, California, with Hyundai, just been published, and we are very fortunate to provide basically the interaction between the rider and the vehicle itself as part of this partnership. So we definitely see this transition coming very, very fast, and not only to the public transportation sector, as you mentioned, where there are congestion problems, and we again believe that only a high occupancy vehicle could solve that, and not the other way around. We see that entering also other sectors of transportation, such as school buses and paratransit transportation. Those are sectors that really need this kind of technology, this kind of software, and for years they are using the fixed route, old school, if we may say, and we really see, of course, as VIA, but also all over the place, these kind of transportation methods also changing in front of our eyes.
Well, I want to stick with sort of, I think Uber is a really interesting phenomenon. I think this is one of the first companies that's been built purely on one of these megatrends that has become a really massive company. But on the one hand, I think there's the question of, have they actually contributed to the social good, given that congestion in a lot of their biggest cities has in fact gone up. But then there's also this other question about profits. They have yet to make them. So I'm curious, in the spirit of reality checking here, and maybe we'll work our way back down the panel. I'm just curious, is this lack of profits and this sort of lack of delivery of the social good of shared mobility specifically, is that something that is just a phenomenon of this sort of early stage of the transition towards that? Or does this point to problems that we really need to be thinking more about and trying to address?
So I can obviously answer on behalf of VIA by saying that we truly believe that this kind of smart mobility should enter the public transportation. And all over the world, majority part of public transportation is being subsidized by the regulator, by the government. And part of that it's because it needs to answer the needs of the citizens and to basically improve the commuting in the city, even from places that are transit deserts, as we like to call them, and are not profitable for private companies to enter. So wherever we enter a city, and having this discussion with the regulator, whether it's a subsidized service or not, we always take that into account. So that's a public service. It should improve the way people move from A to B, regardless other aspirations.
Mr. Wilshire, does Uber's situation concern you at all? Do you think it puts these trends in jeopardy at all?
Yeah, it's Michael, by the way. I think, well, one other thing I'd add to Uber and the other ride-sharing companies is the risk of causing congestion by substituting from public transport. So, and that could become an even more powerful phenomenon as we move to autonomous and the cost of the driver is taken out of the equation, because then you could have much more economic competition between public transport, mass transit, and ride sharing, but this time in a driverless vehicle. So I think that's going to attract a lot of policy attention. It's going to cause congestion, and there'll be all sorts of things like, should you have ride sharing just for part of the journey? Should you somehow retain mass transit for the long distance part, and maybe for the last mile where public transport isn't playing such a strong role and there's demand for it? Have that as either beginning the journey or ending the journey. So congestion is another thing, and it's not obvious that all these ride sharing services, particularly with the advent of autonomous, will improve that. In fact, I think it'll make it worse.
Yeah, and Mr. Agassi, just to kind of broaden that question a little bit for you, so Tesla is maybe another example, like Uber, that's been incredibly successful by certain metrics, but in terms of their core performance as a business, there's clearly been a lot of challenges. Is there a risk if one of these sort of flagship companies for these trends were to go bankrupt or have some form of crisis, that could potentially put the broader trend at risk? Or are these trends so powerful that they can survive one of these flagship companies having sort of existential problems?
So Tesla is not going to die, right? Tesla is making tons of cars. The naysayers, we had Skoda here, so his boss, Diest, just said Tesla is not a niche market maker. I remember VW speaking very differently 10 years ago when they had these cars with tailpipes that spewed out pure air. These trends do not disappear after 1 quarter or 2 quarters or even one loss or another. I think that at this point, if Tesla was somehow to need massive amounts of capital, you would see a car company come and buy it, right? Maybe not at this valuation, maybe at a different valuation, but somebody would come in and buy it. I don't think that the secular spots here would make a difference. If Uber went down, it's not going to bring down the industry. If Tesla went down, it's not going to bring down the industry. But there's a bigger picture that is a lot more, I think, concerning to everybody, and I think a lot more interesting when you look at it. If I buy a car that has variable use, I buy a 4x2 box, because I need sometimes to have myself, sometimes to have 5 people in there, sometimes I need packages inside. But if it's not my car, there's no reason for me to package myself in a 1.5-ton 4x2 box to go from here to the market next door, right? And so if I press the button and a vehicle shows up, I don't need to share that vehicle, I need to share the service, right? So it's a shared fleet, it's connected, right? And if it shows up just for me, because I pressed the one button, it's roughly my size, wrapped in a cocoon with a beautiful AR, VR type environment where I like to spend the next 3 minutes probably getting ads from Google, right? Tomorrow I'll press the button, I'll press the 2 button. There'll be a beautiful car for me, whoever's driving with me, my son, so I can have a conversation with them. And the next day it'll be 6 people. I'm never going to buy a car for 6 people, but I may use it every once in a while. And so that change drastically changes the equations on shared conversation. It changes the conversation on connected or not connected. It changes the conversation on what is the industry building. And it's, by the way, taking out all these players. It's problematic for Tesla, it's problematic for Uber, it's problematic for everybody who's not adjusting to an environment that doesn't buy a car that will be used by me for the next 3 years, right? And so that's a bigger change than if one of them misses a quarter or misses a trend.
And Mr. Becker, we're almost out of time, but I want to ask you to wrap up. It seems like one of the issues here is like perception versus reality, right? And I think one of the reasons people sometimes roll their eyes about the case megatrends is that there is oftentimes a disconnect between perception and reality. I think this is something that's especially affecting the autonomous vehicle industry right now. Can you just share your thoughts briefly on how you think the best way to address those gaps are and to close them?
So I actually a few days ago came across a film from 100 years ago, which showed how Ford built the Model T. It was raw material in, car out. So Ford built the whole car in one factory. Today, 100 years later, we do have an established supply chain. A fraction of the value is added by the car makers. Most of that value comes from an established, several layer deep pyramid of suppliers. If I compare that to autonomous industry today, we have that vertical integration. There are a couple of large players that try to build the whole stack, completely ignoring how complex it is, how costly it is, and how much focus each of the different parts needs to be built. So what I do, and now slowly but steadily, companies have realized that it is extremely expensive, but they are not yet splitting up the stack, looking for suppliers. The current move is to build consortia, to merge. We saw that starting about a year ago. I think that's going to go on for another year or two. And then a couple of clusters will form so that Volkswagen recently invested into Argo. We'll see a few more.
Did you just say Argo? What a wonderful company.
I know.
But please go on.
And I think the next step is then that a supply chain will form. The companies, we see 50 or 80 here outside today, the companies already exist, but still there is too much vertical integration and too many companies are reinventing the same parts all over again, even though they don't provide any differentiator to them. And in the automotive industry, OEMs today focus on what enables them to differentiate and not on the part underneath. So in autonomous, we'll be there in a couple of years.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. We're out of time.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful panel. But we really neglected, because Guy here came in at the very last minute. I didn't get a chance to introduce him. He's the head of business development for VIA. And more importantly, I've used your service in New York City, and it's terrific. The most important question, Edward, you did not ask. Why is VIA and its reliability not available at Ben Gurion Airport? I had to use Get. It was terrible.
I invite you to take a ride at Bubble Service that we're operating together with Daniel
I
here.
like Publix. Thank you so much. And Shai, the Human Driving Association would like to meet you for coffee after the event on me. Thank you very much.